Awesome. All right, so I thought I'd give basically a bit of a discussion on ridge cradle troughs. It's a particular interest in mine, but first of all, the other interest in mine is a little bit of history. Now, a few people may have heard that I think they finally deciphered the last of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and there wasn't really too much interesting in there that we didn't hear about, but there's a couple of little things we found out actually about Australia that were written in there about how our storms actually formed. So, according to the Storm Bible, when God created southeast Queensland, we had to do something to differentiate Queensland to New South Wales. New South Wales is a very cold place, so obviously he said, well, let's give Queensland lots of heat. So, of course, there was heat. And that was really, really great. Now, of course, just the heat just meant we were like the arid lands of South Australia. So he said, well, let's differentiate Queensland to South Australia. So let's give it humidity. So, of course, there was humidity and moisture. Now, on the third day, of course, God saw that, well, look, this heat and moisture, it's pretty oppressive. So let's give them some instability to create some storms, and at least the evenings will be nice and cool. So, of course, there was instability. Now, on the fourth day, God saw that people began to chase storms. However, they became frustrated because the storms kept dying as the chasers got close to them. So then God decided, let's create a low-level jet. That way, of course, the storms will stop decaying so quickly. And of course, he stuffed up. So from then on, of course, Southeast Queensland are constantly running around like headless chooks, chasing after storm that dies after 20-30 minutes. And of course, there's one more little mistake that he made as well. When God made Australian drivers, he also made a mistake too, the ability to keep left unless overtaken. Anyway, so when it comes to low-level jets, of course, we do have a couple of things where things do get a little bit interesting, and of course that is the ridge cradle trough. Now, it's just a term I derived because it's just a pattern that we often notice that arrives that produce really spectacular storms. And ridge cradle trough is exactly that, a trough that is being cradled by a ridge. And the big difference and the big driving factor behind this type of storm setup versus other storm setups is the presence of a deep low-level jet, often from the east-northeast or from the northeast. And of course, this is the single most important factor when it comes to it. So what's an RCT, or a ridge cradle trough? Well, you can see here, is this the little, yeah. So, we have a low or a trough sitting through here, and often what happens is the day prior we get a ridge that pushes up the coastline, and what actually happens is we sort of get this modified air mass that comes through, but the big thing, of course, is we tend to get this strengthening low-level jet. And this is basically present every single ridge cradle trough. So this is another example where we have trough sitting through here, the ridge along the coast, and of course you get this sort of moist southeast and northeast feed, all pouring into the inland areas. And that's the other thing, so with ridge cradle troughs, they tend to very much be an inland feature, or in this case, west of the divide. So of course, there's also a couple of characteristics that occur. So often the day before is nearly always hot with well above average temperatures in southeast Queensland. Southeast change normally pushes through late that day or overnight, and then of course on the day of the actual ridge cradle trough, there is often a tight isothermal gradient, which is the boundary, of course, of the cooler air mass coming through from the east, where it's often it's cool but very, very moist and lots of moisture, whereas often very dry and very hot further west of it. But there's always this very tight isothermal gradient that occurs. And again, just another example, virtually the same, of course, over the dying downs, tight isothermal gradient, which sits right along, of course, where that low-level jet maximum is as well. So the southeast change often produces a very moist and deep boundary layer, and this southeasterly normally swings to the northeast as you push inland thanks to the trough line. As that moves inland, it mixes in with the moisture and of course dramatically increases instability. So this is a very similar process to the modified southeast changes that we could get here in southeast Queensland, but on a larger scale. So there's a modified southeast change on Wednesday actually that went through. It produced a couple of little storms through the Boona area and up towards Rosewood. So it was a very similar setup where it was obviously too dry in front of the change, too far behind the change, it was too cold, but there's basically a small, thin sort of Goldilocks zone type area where of course that moisture and heat is actually adequate. But one feature of course is that we do notice as well is the southeast coast region in these setups is normally very capped. That's because the southeasterly comes through and cools the lower levels too significantly. So of course, this often means that, the good part is, of course, is that, if you're chasing out in the downs, you don't really have to worry about the southeast coast exploding. But further west, the warmer 850 temperatures certainly help mix down. You get that mixture of warmer air mixing down to the surface, and of course the moisture coming through from the modified southeast change, and the capping is certainly not as significant and not normally an issue. So the other big feature, of course, is that there is normally an upper trough over the region. The upper troughs are normally cooler on the day of the RCT rather than before the RCT. And often this is we often see the ridges and upper troughs are generally very well linked. So we get the fact that the ridges push through, but the upper trough persists, and sort of sometimes as well, in some cases also retrogrades. So of course, that's another feature we often see. So, and it can be fairly important because we also have to remember too that when it comes to these types of systems, if you move too far east, it's going to get too cool too quickly because you've got that cooler air mass, even though it's very moist, coming through. So ideally you're going to want some sort of cool air in the upper atmosphere just to help drive and continue that lift, because again, as storms push east, you're going to have a combination of the cooler low levels and of course a stronger capping, and having the presence of the upper trough is certainly going to assist in this. Back in 2015, I sort of coined it the year of the RCT because there's actually quite a few ridge cradle troughs that developed in the Darling Downs. Some of them were quite amazing, and other of them weren't so great, but nearly always they still produced well-structured storms, and this is a good example of a day, so to speak, of where it still wasn't some fairly nice structure, but of course the instability was a little bit weak, and so the cap was also quite strong. But one of the issues that we can get if instability is too weak is that if the low-level jet can actually dominate the environment. So it's very rare that actually happens in Australia, where the low-level jet can kind of dominate things. Certainly much more of an issue in the US. But here you have a case where, of course, the zone of interest, or certainly the zone of convergence, keeps shifting around and eventually gets pushed to the western edge of the storm, which isn't quite so ideal. So which day of these is not a ridge cradle trough? Of course, people will just be guessing, I know, but...
All of them.
So I won't so Marty's actually correct. They're actually all ridge cradle troughs. So it's a trick question. So, there's certainly no shortage of producing very excellent or certainly very photogenic thunderstorms. So what makes a low-level jet so important? Well, certainly Australian storm setups often contain strong winds. This is a combination from high Cape, of course, and of course the other thing is too is a lot of our storm setups occur when humidity overall is actually not that high. So even when we might have high dew points, that might be sitting in the low 20s, often the temperature is low to mid 30s or higher. So certainly this is quite, when we have those types of environments, they're normally quite conducive to strong winds. So of course, when you have this setup, when you've got lots of strong winds in thunderstorms, you often get situations where the outflow is just going to push way too far in front of the storm. So if we have, of course, a strong low-level jet, then that's going to help prevent the outflow from pushing so far in front. And of course, the combination of the low-level jet and outflow colliding can also provide a great opportunity for some excellent-looking storm structure. So this is basically just a very basic conceptual example, at least how I certainly envisage things in my mind in terms of how sort of outflow and inflow sort of work together to either enhance or kill or maintain a thunderstorm. So of course, you might have a certain scenario, and basically let's assume we've got an inflow of 40 k's an hour, which actually here would actually be very, very good. So we have a little shower that goes up and whatnot, and sort of bubbling away, and we have some outflow, just some light outflow, 30, 40 k's an hour going out. This type of scenario, not too bad. There's nothing really happening there. However, the combination of this all sort of occurring can certainly help enhance convergence and help drive further updrafts to go up. So of course, what happens? Well, the storm can get a little bit bigger. And eventually this pattern will keep continuing, providing, of course, there's enough instability. So the storm will get larger. And of course, you'll get perhaps a stronger outflow push again. And you will get to the point, of course, where in a situation of, well, let's say the inflow environment is not very strong, that you could get a thunderstorm with very, very strong outflow. And that can occur very quickly. In Australia, that can occur maybe in 20, 30 minutes at times, where you can actually go from a situation where you have basically just a maturing thunderstorm to all of a sudden it's now severe. If this occurs in an environment where the low-level shear is not very strong, then of course what happens is that the outflow just pushes too far in front. And this certainly is a big killer of thunderstorms. There are certainly situations where perhaps further down the track, as in maybe 50 k's time or even 30 k's time, or sometimes it can actually be a longer distance again, where of course a new storm can reorganise on the boundary of that outflow. But when it comes to thunderstorms and longevity, ideally we don't want them to become outflow dominated. So if we have a different scenario where let's just say the inflow is 80 k's an hour, well, let's just say then assume the outflow is 100 kilometres an hour, we can see that obviously the two vectors there are going to be fairly well balanced. So we have a situation where the inflow is going to keep that storm, the outflow, in check, and the storm will continue to remain inflow dominant. So of course, then it will be much easier then for a thunderstorm to become even stronger, of course, and potentially produce destructive wind gusts if conditions are suitable. So I mean, this isn't to say that you need to have strong inflow to have super strong wind gusts, because of course we know that thunderstorms can produce certainly very strong wind gusts, 160, 180 k's an hour, and that's it. I mean, it certainly happened before. But normally what happens, of course, is once we get this big outflow push, then we have difficulty in terms of trying to maintain that storm structure, and it's going to struggle for longevity. Whereas if we have stronger low-level jets, then that's definitely going to help in terms of storm longevity. And certainly from a chase point of view, a long-lived thunderstorm is much easier to chase than, of course, just going from pulse storm to pulse storm that's only going to last 30 to 60 minutes. So on low-level jets, of course, there are actually a few other ways we do get low-level jets in southeast Queensland. So the most common one, which I think is an interesting one, is, of course, a sea breeze. So it sort of acts as like a pseudo low-level jet. Certainly provides better shear. But obviously, one of the big issues that we do have with sea breeze fronts is that conditions can become too cool. And I guess, from a forecasting point of view, I think Josh will also be doing a bit of research too, I guess, on this as well, is, if you have a storm entering the sea breeze, is it going to A, intensify, or B, is it going to weaken? And that's the tricky part, because sometimes it can be very strong capping when it comes to, when the sea breezes get introduced. The other common one, of course, we often get sometimes just the general winds, the northerly winds, gusty northerly winds ahead of the trough. Although, again, for Australia, normally along the coast, if we get gusty northeast winds along the sea breeze, ahead of the trough, we tend to find that because we don't have a cap, conditions will convect too early and we get a lot of showers and rain. So often, of course, if we get a north to northwest winds, that can be handy and certainly is very supportive of certainly northward movers, but it's not going to be overly moist. So that's certainly one of the issues too. And of course, we have our ridge cradle troughs. So I've gone through a couple of examples. I have gone through this example before, but I've actually included a few other examples too, of just having a look at certainly how these types of systems can certainly develop. So, this is a ridge cradle trough from November 22, 2015. And again, lots of people were chasing this day as well. And there was some very good instability through the Darling Downs. And of course, the precip was quite encouraging as well. The big thing, of course, though, and again, this is another common occurrence that we see in ridge cradle troughs. We can see here, so these are the winds at 950 millibars, so about, sort of about 400 or 500 metres above the surface. And we can certainly see here, the winds are sort of 15, 20 knots sustained coming through, which is actually quite reasonable. But the big thing, and I always watch out for this, particularly, again, for inland setups as well, like for the Darling Downs, is when the shear between 4 and 7 p.m. increases. So, often if we get a big increase at 7 p.m, we actually see that a lot of this occurs sort of an hour or two before sunset, as in this increase here, because we have to remember this is a 3-hour step. And an hour or two before sunset, that low-level jet often ramps up, particularly over the Darling Downs, and especially in these sort of ridge cradle trough setups. And this is sort of really the magic hour, so to speak, that that certainly for me I get very excited about, is when this low-level jet really ramps up. So the other thing, I don't remember what I was saying. So on this part of here, you can certainly see that we've got the best sort of low-level jet is over the Eastern Downs, and of course, we can certainly see that it's very, very moist over the Eastern Downs, where the Western Downs, it's actually a little bit drier. So even though it's dry over the Western Downs over towards Roma, you can still see there still seems to be some instability being picked up through the lithogenetics charts. So if we have a bit of a look, of course, Gatton sounding on this day, which is here, you can certainly see there's decent shear, actually a fairly reasonable amount of instability, but of course we've got a huge monster cap there. So, and you may actually think that this type of sounding, the actual terms of the actual dew point and temperature, is actually quite similar to a sounding you might actually see in the US. The only difference, of course, is that normally the 700 to 500 millibar lapse rates are probably steeper again. So, but this is the type of thing that the US guys will say, hey, this is great, loaded gun sounding. But of course, we know that it's going to be too cool, too cloudy over the southeast coast region looking at this for thunderstorms to occur. So of course, we have to look further west. So if we have a look at Pittsworth, of course, we've got some better instability, still a cap, and certainly you can see the 10 AM sounding in blue. That cap was actually a little bit stronger through there. So the cap does erode throughout the day, as it often does. And I guess the question is here, will the cap break or will the cap break elsewhere? So this was west of Billabilla, and of course we can certainly see here that there's no issues at all with the cap and whatnot. We're going to get some fairly high base storm activity, having a look at the LCLs around 700 millibars, but there's certainly no capping issues at all. So a common scenario for, say, ridge cradle troughs is for high base storms to develop further west, where it's hot and dry, and then move east into an area with better shear and better moisture and often better instability. So, in this case here, we can often see that storms will often develop up here. So this is 700 millibar relative humidity, which I often like to look at when it comes to looking at potential for, say, elevated thunderstorms or thunderstorms that are going to initially interact completely with the surface initially. So, when we click soundings along here, you'll often see that they're basically going to be convecting off that 700 millibar elevated moisture plume. As they convect off there, they can move further east and they move into areas of better surface dew points. And of course, this can produce a few little things, but one of the things, of course, is the lower bases mean they can better utilise the low level shear. And this is particularly important when it comes to supercells. So on this day, of course, we have the start of what we coined just as a joke, the Billabilla Killer. So, and of course this was a sounding, and we can certainly see this is a sounding I showed before, but it's very high based, shear's okay, but it's not really great, it's really north to northwest at the surface, it's not really something you'll get super excited about. So, and this is around 10 to 3. So further east, and this is the storm we're looking at, there was this storm over here, we didn't chase this one, this was the one we were chasing. So, and of course the cells move east into areas of slightly better moisture and instability. We can see that as we click the soundings further and further east, the instability, the moisture